talk a little bit about both undergraduates and producers, because I went back to Greg's original email when I was trying to figure out what to do, and he said undergraduates and producers. So that's what I'm going to focus on, and I'm going to try to divide it into two parts. Okay, so when you think about this, we've got our animal science students. Those are the folks that I deal with every day. They're getting pretty tired of me right now because it's the end of the semester. But I deal with those folks every day. And then we've got livestock producers. I deal with them on a fairly regular basis as well. Okay, now, these animal science students may one day become producers. I have another group down here that simply says others in the livestock industry. That might encompass a lot of the folks that are attending these meetings. Our animal science students may someday in the future be part of this group. So I think it is good to talk about how do we teach genetics to all three of these groups with the idea that we want to do so in a form that's understandable and usable. And it has to be usable for whatever stage that they're in and whatever their backgrounds are. So that's where we have to concentrate. So this morning I'm going to talk about what do we teach, how do we teach it, what are our challenges, and how do we meet those challenges with the students and producers in mind. So first of all, what do we teach? Well, when we think about undergraduate courses, at the University of Kentucky we have a couple of introductory animal science courses. And in the first one of those courses, they get kind of the biology of livestock. And they get some genetics there. Then they come on to my course, which is primarily an industry-related course, and we really don't talk specifically about genetics per se. We sneak a little bit in, but not specifically about genetics. Okay, then we move on to animal breeding and genetics. And this is a course that I've been teaching now for, this is my third time teaching this course. And so I want to share with you just a little bit about what I do with this particular course. So I just pulled out some of the slides that I use on the first day of class. Okay, so I start off by talking about the difference between, or the relationship between animal genetics and animal breeding. And our course is called Animal Genetics. It's really animal breeding. Okay, then the course description, and the students have all of this, so it's not like they have to read it all and write it down. They have it in their syllabus. But just to remind them about, this is what our goal is for this particular course. And you see a couple of words that jump out there. You see the word statistics, they groan. You see Mendelian population quantitative genetics. And then you talk about genetic engineering techniques towards the end of that. So then when we think about what the objectives are, and I just went ahead, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but I've got several learning objectives. And you can see that, okay, we're really talking about, I think they need a little bit of history of livestock breeding. I think that's really interesting. That's because I'm getting old and becoming part of history, they tell me. But I think it's important. And then you'll notice where I start. Okay, I start with Mendelian inheritance. And then we move on through, and again, these are just the objectives that we're going to try to accomplish throughout the semester. Okay, then we go on, a few more objectives here. I have high expectations for this course, and you'll get to the end, and I say, explain how genomic data can be used in genetic improvement. So you'll note that I started out with Mendelian genetics, and I'm ending up with genomics. Okay, our outline that we follow, again, you'll notice that we start off with Mendelian inheritance. Here we get into a little bit our first taste of DNA testing, where we talk about some of the opportunities that we have today for testing many of the genetic disorders that we have in our livestock. We talk about population genetics. We move on and talk about the genetic model. Okay, I also teach statistics courses, so they get a fairly hefty dose of statistics here. I think that's important to them from a real-world standpoint in connecting with the other courses that they have. Okay, then we end up with selection, prediction, large-scale genetic evaluation, and systems of mating. Now, as we went through this outline really quickly, you didn't notice any section that was particularly genomics. Okay, because I try to weave that in throughout any of these sections where I have the opportunity to. Okay, we get into this whole argument about should it be Mendelian or should it be molecular? Should it be tradition versus technology? You saw where I started out, and hopefully I weave in some of the molecular along the way. But if we think about the branches of animal genetics, okay, then these are basically the broad scope of what I try to cover. And as a parent, through everything I've shown you, I start with the Mendelian and try to weave in some of the molecular as well. And I think that's important because I think you've got to cover the first things first. I don't see how you can talk about Mendelian genetics or molecular genetics if students have no idea about Mendelian genetics or population genetics or quantitative genetics. So we start with all those things and then we get to the other part. I think for some of us, and that's me included because my biases as a quantitative geneticist are going to come through here, genomic selection sounds a little scary, but it really just extends our applied or traditional approach to selection, because when we look at our breeding value estimations or our expected progeny differences, then we're still using all those pieces of information that we always have, but we're also in many cases being able to tie in the genomic results. So we're still going to use those EPDs. It simply allows us to have more accuracy, especially with young individuals. Are we at the point in sheep that we can do this? We're not quite as far along as beef, obviously, or dairy, which kind of leads the pack, I think, in all of this. Okay, so then you can also talk about this in production or science courses. Dr. Don Ely at the University of Kentucky teaches our sheep science course, and I come in for 2 weeks and talk about the basics of sheep breeding and genetics. And here is where I get into NSIP, estimated breeding values, and specifically look at things applicable to sheep. We talk a little bit about scraping. We talk a lot about selection. And we talk a lot about mating systems with regard to crossbreeding programs. So I go in and they get about 2 weeks of that, and this is where we really get specific to a species of interest. In this course, I try to weave in things that they're aware of because they go to the farm. We have our Hampshire sheep, we have our polypace sheep, we have crossbred lambs obtained from crossing those two breeds. We've had 3 breed crosses, and we've done some grading up work as well. So we try to weave all of that in to where they have live animals that they can actually see. This is what happens when you cross 2 breeds. This is what happens when you use a rotational cross. So we try to weave in the live animal as much as possible so that they can actually see the results. And then some places have advanced genetics courses. We don't, but some universities might have that we could teach with our undergraduates as well. Okay, then if we move on to livestock producers, what I try to do with our livestock producers, our sheep producers is who I'm primarily speaking about, are look at the genetic principles as they apply to 2 main things, and that's selection and mating systems. And then look at the changing technology, the animal evaluations, and the genomics. But I will tell you right now, I have very little request to talk about these 2 things. Most of the requests I get are to talk about these 2 items. And when I tell you a little bit about some of the challenges, I think you'll understand why. Okay, I think what we teach with livestock producers is need dictated. I think it's also producer driven. And it's applied in nature. It's applied in nature because in Kentucky, we are primarily dealing with small flocks and a lot of beginning producers. Okay, so it's very applied in nature. It's not highly technical, and it's rarely genomic oriented. I told you I hoped you weren't disappointed, but this is the real world, folks. Okay, so then we've talked about what do we teach, how do we teach it. Okay, when we talk about undergraduates, okay, we've got the traditional lectures in the labs where they take notes and they solve problems and they have homework and quizzes and exams and they do all of this. But I think throughout all of this, even though we're talking about the traditional here, illustrations, demonstrations, and examples, the more the better. So they can actually try to see what's going on. And it's not so abstract. And it's not like a black box of genetics, which is how a lot of undergraduates view it. I try to emphasize active learning, and one of the things I do, and I think this is one of the neatest things I do in this course, it's a hands-on experience with the simulation program. And this is done, Greg, with Ron Lewis at Virginia Tech, using his CyberSheep program. The kids think we're using sheep because that's my favorite species. This is just the best that's available for a genetic simulation program. Hey, they get at the beginning of the semester, they get their scheduling. You can see that we're about to make our last matings for this semester. I tell them these are what some of their potential rewards are, and you'll notice there's a lot of things about points up there. And it doesn't say anything about a potential reward is learning about selection. That's because you have to sneak that in, because what they're really understanding is how much is it worth? Is it going to help my grade? Okay, there's some opportunity to do that. And you'll notice that the last thing is fun. And I've begun to see, no matter how hard they're fighting it, some of them are beginning to have fun with it. Okay, so at the end of every round, this is where we get some things going on. I tell them, okay, who's the earnings leader? Whose flock's making the most money? Who's made the greatest change? And also we've got the spider allele in there. And I've got 3 flocks that have just eliminated that from their sheep. And so that's kind of neat. They get all excited about that. The other slides that I have, I wanted to show you, they're selecting for 120-day wait. Okay, they've also got the spider gene to worry about, and they've got inbreeding. Okay, so very real. I mean, it's real. They can do genetic testing. Okay, and if they're like my flock, I think that Ron loaded me up. I'm also doing this, and my flock had the frequency of the allele for spider syndrome was 40% in my flock. I've now reduced it down to 10%. I haven't made a lot of other gains, but I've reduced that. So I think it gives them a really great opportunity to put it in play, to learn. And so what I had on my other slides here, and that's probably an indication that I had too many slides, was to see what was happening with all the flocks with regard to genetic change, inbreeding, and the presence of the spider allele, and so forth. So they can see that, and after every round we talk about it in class. So it's been a great learning experience for the students. Okay, so we'll skip on then to our livestock producers. We do 3 U-Profit schools at the University of Kentucky, U-Profit 1, 2, and 3, and then we do a lambing school. And in addition to those, we have several field days coming up next month. We're going to have our 44th annual Sheep Profit Day. These are all opportunities for communicating with producers on a regular basis. I think with producers, participation. Try to do things where they can actually participate in doing something. Illustration and demonstration. And a lot of times we put our producers that come to these events, we put them on wagons and we take them out into the flocks to see what's going on. And one of our best demonstrations has been a project that I was part of. We took the white dorper, started with some polypay ewes, and we actually had a grading up mating scheme to actually grade the polypay up to the white dorper. And we were able, along the way, to take producers out and see, okay, this is what happens. This is the kind of stuff you can do with genetics. Okay, and so they could see over time what was happening to these sheep. And now they were changing from the polypay. Okay, we were very, very successful in doing that because, and I show this not, well, I guess I show it for 2 reasons. One, because I'm kind of proud of it. But the other one is because it shows you where in about 8 years you could come from purebred polypay sheep to white dorpers that actually could compete on the national level. And I think that has been an excellent demonstration not only to our producers, to our students, because, okay, yes, it's grading up, and not everybody's going to need a grading up program, but it shows them the power of genetics, what you can do with genetics, and we've been able to talk along the way about lots of other things. Okay, local meetings, our state annual meeting, and these kinds of things are things where you go out and they ask you to come and talk about something. Okay, so what you talk about is really dictated by what they think they need to know about. And then publications, I think this is also a really great way. We're very fortunate in Kentucky to have the Hoof Print magazine. And so these are just some of the articles that I've been asked to write about over the last year and a half. Genetic testing, inbreeding. Here producers are thinking about what weight they're going to sell their lambs. And so we did some programs where we talked about what weight you want to sell your lambs really dictates what breeds you use. And we were able to demonstrate that with some live animals. And so we got an article out of that. Then did sneak in some animal evaluation, genetic evaluation information here, and then performance records and then crossbreeding. So these are all some of the things that, just to give you an idea, these are things that the producer group said they wanted me to write about. So that's what I wrote about. Okay, so what are our challenges? And I think this is where you'll begin to see why not so heavy on the genomics, but more on the practical selection, crossbreeding kind of things that we talk about. With our animal science students, these are some of my challenges. Okay, there's a lot of diversity, and I think the biggest problem in teaching a class that's heavily quantitative oriented is that these people do not like math. They will tell you, I'm not good at math. And I'm like, this is arithmetic. This is adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing. And they're right. They're not good at it. Okay? And so then you begin to throw all this other stuff at them, and they're just like, you can see it coming down over their faces because it's math. So you've got to get over that. And then I think genetics is different because they have different thinking skills. The way they study for other classes doesn't work. It's kind of out on an island of its own in our curriculum. There's genetics, and then there's everything else. And so they don't tie it together very well, I don't think. It is kind of rigorous, and the livestock experience or lack thereof comes into play as well. Okay, I took this out of a NIAA article. They were describing over several classes of an introductory animal science class, 79% were females. Their career objectives were veterinary medicine. Less than 5% said they were interested in any phase of food animal production. The species of interest, companion animals, equine, food producing, and off-food producing. As you might expect, beef was number one in that group. Okay, in Kentucky, these are the students I work with. 80% of our undergraduates in animal science are female. Okay, they come from urban and non-farm backgrounds. Most of them have no livestock experience whatsoever. They just love animals. They have little 4-H or FFA participation. They're interested in pre-veterinary medicine until they encounter chemistry. And they're interested in equines, it's Kentucky after all, and small animals. So these are our challenges. So how do you talk about improving sheep or improving beef through selection if they don't have an overview of beef cattle production or sheep production or dairy production? Okay, so it's really hard to get into a lot of the genomics when you're fighting the battle that I've got to help them learn about the industries themselves and what our goals are, and you know, to think about, okay, if I'm talking about selecting for loin-eye area, I want to increase it, but if I'm selecting for animals with regard to the trait back fat thickness, I want to decrease it. Okay, so you're fighting a battle here, and it's not just Kentucky, it's everywhere. Okay, also, I thought this was very interesting. The students were asked the discipline that they perceive to be the most valuable to learn. Do you see genetics up there on that list anywhere? Nutrition, reproduction, and behavior. Okay? Now, I can go out and we tag team a lot, and my partner in crime in this can go out and talk all day about nutrition, and they eat it up. And I go out and I try to talk about genetics. It's hard. And maybe it's just because of my speaking abilities or my ability to relate to them. I don't know. But it's hard. Genetics was not perceived as very valuable. And I think I liked this quote. It's an old quote. It was 1980. Genetics aren't an important economic driver around my ranch unless it causes a wreck. Okay, that's the kind of thing that I think we're dealing with. Okay, with our livestock producers, we have diversity in their goals, their breeds, their flock size, their age, their education, and their experience. This creates a challenge in how you talk to producers. I think the other thing we're fighting is tradition. Tradition can be good, but it can also slow you down. In Kentucky, these are the folks that come to our producer events. We average 40 to 45 people at our U-Profit schools, each one of those. We have about that same number at our lambing schools, and depending upon the weather, we never know what sheep profit day will be. They're older, They're either just retired or they're close to retirement. They're generally pretty educated. They're a couple. They're very naive. They're coming into this more as a hobby. They really, honestly, don't care so much about making money. They have small flocks, 25 or fewer ewes. Okay, we've got 3 groups that I deal with, and this is one of them. The other one is a very young group, 35 to 40, varied education, high school to college. They're very progressive, though. They're very open-minded. They are, however, naive about the sheep industry. They're eager for information. They are serious about making money. That's why they're doing it. And I know for some of you, when I say large flocks, okay, 100 ewes isn't a large flock. In Kentucky, it's a pretty large flock. Okay, so this is the second group. Now, my third group that comes to these events where I try to educate them are young females between 30 and 35. They're typically your stay-at-home moms. They're very well educated. Okay, they're interested in the organic or the natural. They're interested in fiber, the exotic breeds, and they have 12 or fewer ewes, and every one of them have a name. Okay. No number, but a name. Okay. If you look at Wyoming data, okay, this came out last year, 65% of the sheep producers are male, 84% 45 or older, 33% were at least high school graduates, over 20 years experience, but there were some demographic differences by size of the flock. So the very large flocks really contributed to this, and with the smaller flocks you had more more women involved, and you had a little bit differences in education. But I thought trying to tie in 2 different parts of the country, Kentucky and Wyoming. Okay? The next generation of students and producers, who are they going to be? Are they going to come in with more livestock experience? Probably not. Okay, so how do we deal with that? Okay, and what effect does this have on the livestock industry? Okay, so how do we meet these challenges? I'm almost done. Okay, well, with undergraduates, I think we have to give them increased exposure to food animals, because it's not that they don't like them or don't want to work with them, they just don't know anything about them. And the more that you expose them to it, the better. Greater emphasis on career opportunities, more hands-on. It may mean that we have a change in our teaching philosophy and our methods of instruction, and we probably need to integrate our genetics into courses better. Okay, with our livestock producers, I think you need to know your clientele and you know their needs. So I spend every opportunity I can when I have that situation to visit with our producers and see where they're at and what they want to know. Okay, we have to address the basics first. I mean, production goals, record keeping, selection, mating plans. Okay, before we ever talk about genomics, especially in the sheep industry, because we're not, I mean, when I talk about genomics, I'm really talking about genomics as it relates to enhanced EPDs and not DNA testing or not genetic testing, because we can talk to them about that. But I think you also have to be realistic. So I go back to where I started with all of this. I think the idea is that my role is to try to teach these different groups about genetics in a way that they can understand and in a way that's usable, and eventually we'll get to the point where genomic information hopefully is just as prevalent in the sheep industry as it is in dairy and beef and some of the others, and so we'll incorporate that in. For students, I think they need to have a better knowledge base as they go out into their careers, whatever those may be. For our producers, I think we want to help them better understand how they can improve their livestock, whether they've got 6 ewes or whether they've got 106, and then prepare them to accept the changing technologies.